not like to be insulted. Putin takes it very personally. He harbours a grudge. He doesn't forget. And he will find some way of getting some degree of revenge as a result of that. That perhaps, somehow, for some reason, Ukraine did. This is a fictional narrative that has been perpetrated to propagate the entire system. Because I think what our colleagues at the Department of Homeland Security have done at the state and local government level, our local... There was much more of a decision after Turkey decided to purchase S-400s from Russia, that this was really kind of shifting the whole strategic balance. A lot of complaints coming in from Israel as well about more of a hostile Turkish stance, and obviously from the Greek government itself and other regional players. And so this thinking starts to become then, well, can the Greek-US relationship take on more strategic components? And so we saw under the Trump administration tentative efforts to form a strategic partnership with Greece, kind of thinking how that would take place, more close sets of meetings at the higher level, visits to Athens, thinking about whether we could create a format, a kind of a task force for exploring those relations. And I think that put things onto a different footing. I think that that would be an area, this is not ideological, but this is where there wouldn't be a shift from Republicans to Democrats, for example. I think there would be much more of an interest in continuing to explore how much more we can build on a Greek-US relationship. And if, we had obviously a very strong ambassador, Jeff Pyatt, in Greece, who really did an awful lot. He is obviously he wasn't a political appointee. He comes out of the State Department. There's talk about him playing a more important role in the State Department as well. And given the development of the relationships under his tenure, I think we could expect that to continue. Obviously this is in the period in which the breakthrough was made with Greece and Northern Macedonia on the name issue. And there was a great deal of involvement by Ambassador Pyatt and his colleagues from the region to try to resolve this. And that was also part of trying to move along the Greek-American relationship so it wouldn't be bogged down in obviously very important issues from the Greek perspective, but from the United States, things that were more seen as obstacles to actually putting Greece in a much larger regional perspective. I think there was a lot of hope on the part of the United States that Greece could play a bigger regional role. I think President Trump really embraced the relationship with Greece because Greek Americans are so prominent in American politics. He had a very positive impression of Greece. It was all very superficial, I have to say. And, having, been the senior person at the National Security Council with Europe, including Greece, in my portfolio, I didn't detect any particular view that he had formed about either Prime Minister Tsipras or Mitsotakis. So I don't think that there was anything that would shape the view based on those interpersonal relationships. I know there was a very awkward moment in the Rose Garden during Prime Minister Tsipras's visit when John Roberts from Fox News raised some comments that Prime Minister Tsipras had made about Donald Trump when he was a candidate for the president. But that was more of a blip than anything else. There was no impact whatsoever. Well, actually, I was at university with Prime Minister Mitsotakis back in the day before, really? He entered into his political career. He was at Harvard University. We were in graduate school together, and I used to actually have dinner with him in the graduate student dorms. It never occurred to me that, so many years later, that we would end up meeting in such an important official position. So, obviously, I have a very high opinion of him. I had a high opinion of him when I was a student. I just never expected, so many years on, you never know where the person that you're, carrying your dinner tray to and sitting at the same table will end up, these days. So that was kind of a very nice surprise, much later. But I'd actually met Prime Minister Tsipras early on when he came to Brookings to give a talk. And I have to say, we were very impressed with him. So I know, they're very different people, obviously from very different political backgrounds, but both of them were impressive in their own right. And I do think that Prime Minister Tsipras handled the relationship with the United States very carefully and very cleverly. we're seeing is a kind of return of historical relations between Russia and Turkey in, what we in further west used to call the Near East, but that's your neighborhood. We're kind of seeing, in some respects, a kind of return to some of this Ottoman, Russian imperial perspective in the region, which I think is quite risky. Russia clearly sees Syria as a platform for its own force projection into the Eastern Mediterranean region. And we've seen Russia move not just from Syria, but then to Libya, and in fact, bringing forces from Syria into Libya to expand its footholds and platforms for operations in the Mediterranean as a whole, which is rather troubling. But this again follows a long historic pattern where Russia's always had aspirations to be a player in the Mediterranean and only saw the Black Sea as just one part of a larger regional perspective. And obviously, Russia has a very different view on its relationships with the Kurds in Syria. And Turkey intervened in Syria precisely because it sees risks to its eastern flank from the PKK and from other Syrian groups operating, Kurdish groups operating in northern Syria, and wanted to create a buffer zone. And we see then Turkey and Russia getting into a very tense standoff, because Turkey has, in many respects, blocked Russian aspirations to reconsolidate power in Syria for Assad. And then we see Turkey muscling in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think this has been, has put Russia somewhat on the back foot. I mean, it's clear that Russia, in many respects, at least clear to me and others who've been analysing this, allowed Azerbaijan to really try to resolve the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict through force after so many efforts at diplomacy had failed from Azerbaijan's perspective. And Azerbaijan went much further, one might argue, than Russia would have anticipated because of Turkey jumping in and giving Azerbaijan a military assist with drones and other clear assistance on the battlefield, which allowed Azerbaijan to push much further forward than Russia might have anticipated, and really changing the whole calculus on the ground. And now Turkey has become a factor in Nagorno-Karabakh, which it had not been since the ceasefire in 1994. And Turkey has not been, behaving as a NATO member, we would expect. The acquisition of the S-400s was a problem for NATO as well, because that brought in, Russian technology into the NATO alliance. There was a lot of concern that was expressed by NATO countries. There was a strong expectation that Turkey would essentially not take the S-400s out of the box and test them, but Erdogan did. And that was contrary to, behind the scene agreements that had been made or understandings that had been reached, including with the US government. So, that also showed that Erdogan in particular was trying to test the limits. The Turks say that, there are many Turks who are, deeply invested in NATO and have been, very active within the NATO headquarters in senior roles. And they've made it very clear that they value being members of NATO. But the NATO itself then has to figure out how to exert some influence and, kind of more firmly set rules. First of all, President Trump had a very particular view of Russia that I think is really framed by his own life experience. So if you think, back to, President Trump's lifetime frame, he was born in 1946. So he would have been, 16 thereabouts when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And then, in the 1980s, he was in his 30s and 40s. And the reason that I'm saying this is important because his perspective on Russia is framed by nuclear weapons and by multiple crises between the United States and the Soviet Union that could have led us to the brink, and almost did, of nuclear war. And in the 1980s, he actually put himself forward to offer to be the arms control negotiator for Ronald Reagan. He was extraordinarily interested in this issue. He saw it as an existential threat. And for him, the most important issue all going forward until his presidency was trying to resolve the nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, and then Russia and the United States. So he came into office wanting to resolve arms control. And he said that very openly, made it through many interviews. It just got lost in all of the noise about the intervention of Russia in 2016. Then there were two other issues. First of all, as we know, President Trump was very much focused on China. And he believed that he could win Russia over to the United States side to create a coalition against China. That, frankly, was completely and utterly unrealistic. But he didn't see that. And then the third issue was Iran, and it was very similar. President Trump thought that he could win Russia over into a coalition against Iran as well, which again, or rather people around him did, which again was a big mistake. Perception on many fronts that the election had been swayed in some respects by the Russian intervention, that they tipped the scales in favor of Putin. Many people saying that Putin rather had tipped the scales in favor of Trump. Many people saying that Trump wouldn't have been elected had it not been for the Russian intervention. I think we can see in 2020 that that was not the case, that there were larger dynamics in US society that were at play. But the whole perception was shaped by this. And the Mueller report, as you suggested, because it started or was partly started by the idea that there was collusion between the campaigns, rather than looking primarily at what did Russia do to intervene in the election, this started off this whole domestic dynamic. President Trump could not see past the idea that he was being investigated. He found this, it was too personal for him. The idea that he hadn't won the election on his own, was, a little bit too much for him at times to handle, because President Trump was so affected by this, I would say personally, psychologically, that he had to attack the entire idea that Russia had intervened in the elections in 2016, which they had. He couldn't divorce the personal aspects of this from the larger political issue of Russian intervention in US domestic affairs. US politics has also become almost like a political assassination. You're hiring hitmen to go and, basically denounce and find derogatory information to kill somebody else's candidacy. And that's clearly what the Trump campaign were trying to do with Hillary Clinton. And that's also what the Russians were trying to do. They were trying to harm her. And there were, good reasons in their view. They saw it as a security threat. Putin took personally things that she said when she was Secretary of State. They assumed that she would take a very tough policy line towards Russia as president. And they wanted to make sure that she was weakened as possible. I'm not sure that they anticipated that Trump would get elected, but I think they certainly wanted to make sure that Hillary Clinton won by the smallest possible margin, and that there were lots of questions about her presidency when she became president. So I think, what the Russians were trying to do was really kind of also put a big question mark about the whole electoral outcome in 2016, because they resent deeply the United States international pronouncements about free and fair elections and criticisms about the conduct of elections in Russia and elsewhere. And they wanted to show that the United States was no better than anywhere else. It was, in the first instance in 2016, the emergence of this really hyper-partisan environment that made it easier for the Russians to manipulate things. And I think, as a result of that intervention, as you're saying, that partisanship became even more extreme. For Russians, and certainly the Russian security services and Vladimir Putin, this was a massive victory without even really doing so much. Yes, it was a sophisticated influence operation, but it was an old-style influence operation from the Cold War, one that you would be very familiar with in Greece. And from your own experience that the Russians attempted to mess up the North Macedonia-Greece resolution and some of your other rapprochements, but you were wise to that in Greece, and we should have been wise to that in the United States. I mean, in many respects, we gave them a victory by our own domestic overreaction, and it was one of the reasons why I went into the government in 2016, because for someone like me who's been looking at Vladimir Putin and Russia for decades, it was obvious what they were doing, and we were kind of in our own sort of semi-hysterical reaction exacerbating the problem. We were making it worse. And we had to kind of figure out, how to be more dispassionate about it in our response, but we were not, because it helped to trigger off a massive domestic crisis. And that then, created an obvious, directly related, counter-reaction from Republican circles, from President Trump himself. One side saying you're illegitimate, the other side saying no, you're illegitimate, and kind of fed in, I think, to all of the events that we've seen over the course of 2020. And now, as you're saying, there was a very high percentage of Republican voters who believe that Joe Biden is illegitimate and still believe that President Trump won the election. I mean, that was an outright lie. And, this is extraordinarily problematic for the United States moving forward. I think, President Biden is trying to recreate a sort of sense of non-partisan bipartisanship in national security and foreign policy, but this is going to be very difficult because the whole issue of Russia became so highly politicized. But I think it's that domestic dimension of the United States that's tearing itself apart in partisan rancor that makes us more unreliable. So the actual events of January 6th were they were one episode in a whole series of events and actions that President Trump had been taking throughout the whole course of 2020, and one could argue earlier as well. Because the reason that President Trump was impeached on the first instance was a result of a phone call in 2019 that I was not witness to. I was not witness to the actual phone call, although I was actually called up to give testimony during that the hearings for that first impeachment procedure. That phone call was between the president and President Zelensky of Ukraine, in which he was clearly putting pressure on the president of Ukraine to open up investigations into actions that were purportedly taken by then Vice President and potential candidate for the presidency, Joe Biden, and his son in Ukraine. And so one could argue that's all part of the same set of actions, showing very clearly that President Trump wanted to stay in power no matter what. President Trump has actually declared the Republican Party as his party. It's no longer actually a congressional or a parliamentary party. It's more of a, to be frank, a personality cult at this particular moment. And it's kind of lost its political platform. And so I think, what we're going to see in the beginning, because President Trump has said he is the candidate for 2024 again, he has the right to run again, is a big debate that's going to be playing out about this very question that you mentioned about penalties, because there may be civil penalties. And that was also opened up as a possibility. He didn't get any penalty from Congress because there wasn't sufficient votes to put through any legal consequences. But he is not in any way immune from civil cases. And there's already been some members of Congress who have lodged civil cases against President Trump, for the attack on Capitol Hill by, this mob that was certainly moved from his rally. I don't want to prejudge everything, but, moved from his rally to storm the Capitol, and certainly, whipped up, and inspired by, comments that he made there. And then there was also, really a kind of a fight and a struggle for the Republican Party going on. Is this the Republican Party that of old that has a kind of a platform? Or is this a new Republican Party with a different platform? Or is this just the party of Donald Trump and people who are loyal and support him? I absolutely do stand by my decision to go in. I already touched upon this because the decision was really framed by what had happened in 2016. As someone who has worked, for decades on Russia and the former Soviet Union, I previously served in government between 2006 and 2009 in the National Intelligence Council. I was the National Intelligence Officer, the senior analyst for the US government on Russia and Eurasia. I already served in 2 other presidencies and 2 other administrations, because it was the end of the Bush administration and the first year of the Obama administration that I was there. This was a completely neutral, non-political, non-partisan position, of course. But, you know, I already knew about some of the risks and the dangers that we were facing with Russia. But in 2016, you know, I saw the intervention for what it was. And when I was approached to be asked to come into the National Security Council, of course, you know, I was very mindful of the domestic politics and very worried about these. And not being a political person, you know, I did worry about how I would be able to handle this. But I also hoped that on the national security front, it would be possible to do something without it getting embroiled in the domestic politics. Now, what I regret is probably being more naive about US domestic politics and not doing my homework as time went on about who the various players were in the US domestic political environment. I knew more, frankly, about what was going on in Russian politics than I did in US politics. I should have been going home every night when I just wanted to go home and sleep because it was so late, watching Fox News and, you know, kind of being on the internet, looking people up. I should have been doing my same Kremlinology, you know, in the White House. And that's why, you know, I have regrets that I didn't. Because, you know, I thought, you know, I'm a national security professional. You know, I don't need to be, you know, getting into this mess. And then, you know, as a result of that, I got myself caught out and got myself embroiled, you know, as everybody saw publicly, you know, in a whole load of things that led up to the first impeachment. And I should have been a bit more mindful of this. It was like being in a minefield, but not reading the sign when you first went in. And then, you know, you asked me about women. Yes, there's still a lot of misogyny and sexism, but there's a heck of a lot more women in the national security space and in foreign policy and in politics, particularly in Europe. I mean, in Greece yourself, you've had, you know, kind of many women in very prominent positions. And, you know, I think that there's been a real shift in generations. You know, the generation ahead of mine, people like Madeleine Albright or people like Condoleezza Rice, you know, they really broke glass ceilings. Hillary Clinton, you know, herself, and, you know, kind of forged a path for others. But I mean, I'm roughly the same age as Kamala Harris. You know, we can now see, you know, a whole generation, you know, of women in their 50s and, you know, kind of above, where there's a very large number. And then even more coming up in the younger generations.